Welcome to the Relationship, Communication and Expression presentation. My name is Robert. I'm the director of MSpace. We're a service that works with schools to support children and young people around their emotional well-being and their social and emotional learning. This presentation is one that I had the privilege of delivering at Birmingham University in 2019, just before lockdown. And this whole presentation is a way to help staff in terms of their orientation. So this is supporting teachers around how they position themselves when it relates to their teaching role. And we're not just thinking about how they teach in the classroom, but we're also thinking about how they position themselves as educators. So it's our view and opinion, backed up by research and theory, that in incorporating relationship in a deliberate way, communication and expression, we can help children and young people to engage better, more holistically, but we can also support staff to feel more part of the process, not just passing on information, but actually having a real significant investment into the life of those children and young people who are entrusted into their care. So this is something that we fully take on board as a service. Our service is relational, so we seek to build relationships with all stakeholders. So that includes the teachers that we support and have conversations with. It includes the children and young people who we work with on a one-to-one basis, and the parents by extension, who are key to any success that we will achieve with any intervention that we're delivering. So this presentation is really about helping staff to think in more therapeutic ways, more relational ways, and ways which are more holistic. It's our view, my view certainly, that relationship, communication, and expression, these three factors are non-negotiables. They're indispensable components for life. That means it makes them even more valuable and necessary for development right across the board. Before we proceed into the actual meat of the presentation, let me give you something to chew on. This is a little bit of a quiz, something for you to think about, which does have relevance to the presentation, and also something to get you thinking. The Water Displacement Company, to be continued. So what we can see from the image beneath is that we have an acronym of COG, which is C.O.G. That stands for Child, Organization and Guardian. The organization represents a school or whatever education facility is involved within that process. And the guardian represents the parent, carer, or the person responsible for the child. We've used the cog symbol because that's probably the clearest way, certainly in terms of images in our mind, for what we are trying to achieve as a child moves through the education system. So the statement beneath says, if we are to overcome behavioral barriers occurring in school, each part of the system will need to play its part. And that's precisely what this image is trying to convey, that as these systems come into contact with each other, each of them has the capacity and the responsibility to transfer motion in the right direction. So it means that that child is moving through the education system, supported by the school and also by the parent or carer, who has a major role to play within that progress or desired progress for the child. And it means that unless there is that transfer of motion, we're not going to see the results or the outcomes that we want to where the child is concerned. So building on the ideas from the previous slide, what we can see here is looking more specifically at the child and the organization. We can see where the cogs are the projections on the edge of that first circle image, and those two cogs have to interact with each other. We've used a bit of science, a bit of physics to explain further the concept, and an image of Charlie Chaplin as well, thrown in for good measure. But what we're looking at effectively here is what we call the law of momentum, or what is also known as the law of inertia. And what that law says is that an object in motion will stay in motion until it meets a resisting force, and vice versa. Object which is standing or is in a static position will remain in that way until it receives a transference of force which will set it within motion. Children come to school in both of those scenarios. On the one hand, they are already in motion and it becomes an easier process to continue their development in terms of learning, to maximize the capacity and ability which they have. Some children come in motion, but something happens along the way which causes that motion to stop. And some children just really struggle and they're very sporadic in terms of how they move through the education system. What we want to draw attention to here is that if we simply focus on outcomes and objectives without looking at processes, what we arrive at is problems. And what is meant to put that in another way is that if we don't look at the ways in which we incorporate theory into what we're trying to achieve, we will be seeking solely for objectives without thinking about some of the intrinsic things, such as what we're speaking about here, which will allow relationship to be formed, communication, and also expression. And these things are key, as we will see as we go along. But it's sufficient to say at this stage that the transference of motion as those two systems come into contact with each other is the key focus, and we need to understand how that occurs. So we've established that connection is the thing that allows us to create motion, to transfer motion, to have something to move in a forward direction. And I know as educators, that is your desire. That's what you got into the profession for, to see children achieve their potential and to move forward through the system to increasing levels of competence and ability. And so this idea of cog is one where we see that no connection equals no motion, no transference of motion. But not only that, but where there's a poor connection, and I can remember having a bike, hence the image, and sometimes where the chain would slip off the cog and it would result in what we call a bumpy or rickety ride. And sometimes you have that as well. It's a bit hit and miss. So sometimes it seems to be going well, and at other times and seasons, it seems as if there is a disconnect, or things are not working or moving as smoothly as we'd hoped they would. And so what we need is a lasting solution, something that will ensure that children move smoothly through the education system. In the next slide, we'll talk about relationships specifically. But there's just a few more points to make about the system as a whole before we get to that stage. And this ties into why we introduced you to the Rocket Chemical Company, and also why we've used the theme that you may have noticed within the presentation with the water bubbles or air bubbles. So one of the things why we use that alongside the cog is because we realize within any system whatsoever, there's always going to be friction wherever systems come together and interact. What we mean by that is any systems being the home family system, the education system, the societal system, whenever they come into interaction with each other, there will always be some level of friction. That's just the nature of things. And so there is a tendency sometimes when those systems begin to interact with each other, and certainly in our experience working with schools, children, young people and families, that sometimes we do see breakdowns in relationship. And what it means is that what we are hoping to accomplish for that child, because of the breakdown in relationship, maybe between school and home, the casualty of that tends to be the child and the learning. And that's what we mean when we say drop the baton. So where that information would be transferred, that learning would be transferred, sometimes the learning falls through the gaps because there's been an issue in terms of the relationship between those systems, between the school and the family and the parent as a result of that. And when that happens, distrust enters into the system, which interferes with that process and that transfer. And it means that communication breaks down, or communication becomes less clear or transparent. Sometimes it even becomes very offensive. And then we get to a stage where there can be a standoff and there's no communication, or communication is not progressive, it's regressive. So many things can happen when those systems interact from a systemic point of view. And this is the reason why it's important to have theory to undergird the way in which we interact with those systems. So what we're saying is this relationship, communication, and expression, these are not just great ideas or wonderful additions. As I said at the beginning of the presentation, these are non-negotiable necessities because they relate to life on a whole and to development. So these are things which are paramount for you in terms of how you build relationship, how you support your students, and even how you are fully able to fully engage yourself with your role as an educator. So let's start with the relationships. So we have a quote, first of all, from Gregory Bateson, which is that relationships for human beings, as for all mammals, are our primary form of existence. It says, before our birth, we are physically dependent on our mother for our life. And it also goes on to say that we are born into pre-existing complex networks of relationships that we did not choose. We depend on these relationships for physical, emotional, and social sustenance, and this has ramifications for the rest of our lives. So relationship, the idea that we relate to somebody, that we relate to each other, and the idea that in that relation we are able to move towards a goal, be that friendship, be that learning, the idea that we relay information in the context of relationship. All these interrelated terms suggest that relationship is key and essential. And what's really interesting about relationship is in the context of therapeutic work, where we support children and young people around their well-being from a mental or emotional standpoint, one of the key factors over and above whatever theory is used, so whether, for example, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is used, whether it was psychotherapy, whether it was counseling, whatever the practice may be, the largest factor within the success of that intervention is always a relationship. So if there's no relationship, if there's no sense of relationship and feeling that one can relate to somebody or can be related to, it somewhat hamstrings the rest of whatever is seeking to be done. So relationship is that common ground that breaks down barriers. It's also an important vehicle for transmission and translation. So transmitting ideas, transmitting value. Relationship is the context in which it occurs. And isn't it interesting that once you see a child or your class for a term or 2 terms, as you move on through that process, the thing that is formed is relationship. And you begin to understand that person, learn more about their character, learn more about their personality and their temperament. All of these things are vital for relationship and being able to build something that will outlast your authority. Sometimes, and this comes in the context of my work with parents, one of the key things which I help them to understand is that relationship outlasts authority. What is meant by that is that authority over time will always gradually decrease. That is the natural order of things. But while authority decreases, the idea is that relationship increases, and eventually obedience will not need to come because of authority, but obedience and consensus will come because of relationship. So relationship is one of the central factors and components for being able to engage and feel engaged in your teaching capacity. Moving on to communication. Communication sits most comfortably in the seat, as it were, of relationship, which is to say that once that relationship has been formed, even in its early stages, communication then becomes smoother and easier to engage in. Taking that a step further, it is impossible for us not to communicate. since even silence or saying nothing communicates something. We communicate on a verbal level and a non-verbal level. So all our behaviors are communication of some sort. When we think about children in their early years, one of the greatest predictors of anger or behavioral problems, even such as self-harming behaviors, comes about because children struggle to communicate. So where they struggle to make themselves understood, to speak, to pronounce, or to acquire language, a bit like me right now, what can tend to happen then is that becomes a source of frustration. And that frustration often filters out into aggressive behavior, which sometimes can be directed internally, such as head banging and other self-harming behaviors, as well as externally, where that can be lashing out at others. So it's very clear then that the inability or the difficulty of communication feeds itself and finds expression in frustration. This is why communication is so important. The other thing about it, as is noted in part B, is that community is created through communication. So whilst there's a clear mandate to teach and to transfer information, if we want to see our schools and our classrooms become more community oriented, we need to be more considerate of giving room, and we'll talk about that more in expression, but creating opportunities for communication to take place. And in so doing, what we will do then is be able to engage our learners more, because one of the biggest issues, and I'm sure you would have noticed this as teachers, is the great enemy called boredom. And the fact that so many children and young people struggle in terms of their levels of stimulation. And so the minute they find something boring or not enticing or engaging, they disengage and they find other things to do. And that results in, as we know too well, disruptive behavior, challenging behavior, and just being a distraction to others as well. So communication allows us to facilitate and to induce an interest within the learners, and the better engaged our learners are, is the more they'll take on the information, own the information, and be able to benefit from what we're trying to do. So communication is essential. And that takes me on to the final of our three elements, which is expression. The significance of expression is that it is the key to unlocking every individual's uniqueness and therefore their own specific genius. It was in fact Einstein that drew comparisons between different species, and he was saying that every one of these species were geniuses in their own context, but they needed to be engaged on a level playing field. So we are not asking monkeys to swim or fishes to climb trees. That's in effect what he was saying, and used a few other animals and species as well. But the same is true when it comes to expression. There's something intrinsically built within us as human beings that we all have an opinion, and we all feel a strong level of need to express ourselves. And I think this image that we use here captures that idea and sentiment really well as a passage in the Bible from Job chapter 32. So when we think about expression, there is a biology of expression, there is a psychology of expression, and there is also a danger of suppression. Rather than go through the verses of Job 32 and 10 verse for verse, I'm going to summarize it and paraphrase it. What occurred within this story is that a young man had sat for a long time listening to three elders, older people than himself, while those three individuals somewhat interrogated their friend Job, who had been going through a very difficult time. And this young man, whose name is Elihu, having patiently, respectfully waited for the senior ones to express their opinion, decided that he had something to say. And the way he positioned what he had to say is the whole idea of what expression feels like for us as individuals. So Elihu said something to the effect of, I need to speak because my belly or on the inside, I feel like a wine or wineskin that has no vent. And we can recognize that in modern day terms as any type of carbonated soda, fizzy drink, when it's been shaken up and needs to be opened. And that whole idea of the need to express, we see it quite clearly in the image of the boy in the classroom who thinks he knows the answer to the question and he's desperate to show the teacher what he knows or what he thinks he knows. And I'm sure every teacher's been in that situation where they've thrown out some question and all of the, or many of the children in the classroom are suddenly on the edge of their seats and on their tiptoes, almost bursting to give an answer. And for me, that's a very, very good example of what we mean by expression. It is the idea that everyone has something valuable to express and communicate. And so when we get down to the danger of suppression, what we're saying effectively is that if we do not create space and give the impression that what that person has to say is valuable, we're losing a great opportunity to engage them, to support their sense of esteem and worth and value, as well as their own idea that they are intelligent and they have something valuable to say. So we're simply saying that incorporating expression into your learning space, expressing yourself as an individual. And that's not just about your content or curriculum, but also finding ways to express yourself, to show that you're a real person with real ideas and real thoughts and things of that sort can go a long way in terms of in building relationship, encouraging communication, and giving people, your students, the capacity to express themselves as well. So there's a biology, there's a sense that if we don't speak, we're going to burst. There's a psychology, there's a sense that I have something very important to say. And there's a sense of the danger of suppressing and not giving room and space for individuals to share. If we can do that, we'll get them far more engaged than if we just compel them to sit and listen and suppress what they have to say or what they think they can offer to the conversation. So as we pull all of this together, the most important thing to understand is that this framework is not necessarily suggesting there's lots of different things you need to do. So your existing methods in terms of training, in terms of your targets, and those things which are necessary, which you're already doing, need to continue quite simply. Your letters that you will send out, newsletters, coffee mornings, phone calls, all of those things are essential parts of what you do. For children, they will need to continue to be observed, assessed, to reach their cognitive targets and development and things of that sort. But what we're saying is that it is the understanding that these three elements are interconnected. That's the most important takeaway from this. And that as we incorporate things which are intrinsic to life, which is relationship, communication, and expression, as we integrate these into the existing systems, they will help to ensure that motion continues. And it's the time that we live in where we are seeing ever increasing need, and we are seeing where there's a greater requirement for these systems to work together more closely. We can see what happens when they work in isolation, that we don't get the motion that we would be looking for. But when they are more closely interconnected, interrelated, then we find that we can have better outcomes. And we stand a far better chance of succeeding rather than trying to do things in isolation. So we're saying effectively teachers reassembling is thinking about how we interweave into all the existing processes, which most of the time are not wrong, they're not bad, they're not things that would not bear fruit, but it's just that there are principles that would undergird and be woven into them. So these things need to continue, but it's important to remember to keep relationship at the heart of it. And maybe sometimes it's not the actual teaching staff who can do that or offer that. Maybe it's the pastoral, the heads of years or learning mentors, but it's something that needs to be considered and incorporated. So that relationship, that means of communication, the lines, channels of communication with the child, with the guardian, which is so crucial, and finding and giving them scope and room for expression. These things woven into the existing parenting programs, training, interventions, coffee mornings, whatever it may be, will yield greater fruit than if they're delivered in isolation. And so in conclusion, I would encourage you to bring your personality into your profession. Of course, that's within limits and as is appropriate, but it still gives greater scope for what we said before about relationship. Recognizing it's important and knowing that it has a part to play. So your personality, your relationship, being deliberate, intentional in terms of building that with your learners will produce fruits. So don't leave yourself behind. Include yourself, your person, as well as your profession. The second thing, as it relates to communication, is not muzzling the messenger. So yes, we deliver curriculum, but also including yourself and your context into what you're teaching will make it more engaging for your learners. Thirdly and finally, do not forget your why. Do not be fearful, do not be apprehensive to include and introduce expression into your space, so that you can also cater to your needs of expressing, because you need to express yourself, your passion, your understanding, who you are as a person, which is integral to your environment which you're trying to create for your learners. To some extent, maybe you are competing, not in a negative way, but perhaps with the next teacher or the next lesson in terms of the quality of engagement. So it's important to at least consider these things and hold them in mind so that your person is involved in what you're delivering, because it will encourage the persons that you're teaching to also meet you in that sphere and that space, and not just feel like they're on a production line with more information to process and consume. And so we come to our conclusion. At the beginning of the presentation, you were presented with a story about the Rocket Chemical Company. And if you hadn't guessed or Googled it by now, we are talking about the world famous WD-40 and how they attempted 40 times before coming up with a formula to prevent corrosion. So where you see our water bubble theme within our presentation, where we've used the cog as a system, what we are in fact talking about is the friction that occurs in all systems, including human relational ones. And that friction is inherent and is inevitable. And what we need to do is to find means and methods for creating smoother friction. And so our humble suggestion to you is that by incorporating the components of relationship, building relationship with our learners and our wider community, including parents, facilitating communication, which means we communicate not just the curriculum or the content, but we encourage communication in terms of dialogue, and giving people the opportunity to communicate and be themselves. And finally, expression, so that we encourage and facilitate expression, because these are non-negotiable, indispensable factors and components that relate to our lives as individuals. And so this is a simple acknowledgement that we are working in a system with moving parts, which therefore require maintenance. These needs that we have are authentic needs, not just wants, they're needs. And needs do not simply disappear, they just resurface in other ways. There is a time to pay attention to them and to give them their due and necessary regard, of course, but we want to see in what way we can incorporate them into our learning spaces so we can encourage smoother the smoother transference of motion we can get children and young people to reach their potential and to develop holistically into the people that they are supposed to be. And I'm sure you'd agree with me that if you're able to achieve that as an educator, you'll be very pleased, proud, and satisfied of the part you've had to play. Thank you for watching this presentation. It's been a pleasure to present it to you. I hope it's useful and useful for you. And if you require any more information, please feel free to reach out to me at robert@mspace.org.uk. Thank you for watching.